Thank you, Salia. So the recording is in progress. So as I was saying, my name is Lionel Faton, assistant professor here at Webster Geneva University. I created this platform, Webster Geneva Global Dialogue, to provide a space for experts to discuss topics of international politics and topics that I hope will be of interest to you. Today, the topic I chose for this first conference is revolving around China and US relationship. I chose this topic, well, because I'm a bit selfish and I'm interested, so I chose this topic also because of my interest, because also this is, and I will not teach you anything in saying that, one of the most consequential bilateral relationships we will have in the 21st century. And of course, I will not surprise you when I'm saying that this relationship has been under stress during the last few years. I mean, we have seen that the multi-dimensional rise of China and its growingly assertive foreign policy in the region has triggered tensions and unease across the Indo-Pacific region. On the other hand, I will also not teach you anything in saying that we have seen over the past few years a consensus building in Washington, D.C., recognizing China as the strategic competitor of the United States. And by definition, having a consensus leads to a foreign policy that is more, I would say, confrontation. And today we are in 2021 at a point where these tensions between the United States and China are allegedly at the highest point since, I would say, the 1970s and you remember the rapprochement during the war. Now, therefore, just what I said is something that you have all heard many times. But there have been two events that were extremely interesting over the past few months. One was in mid-September, the announcement of AUKUS, this agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, which beyond cooperation on cybersecurity, on space, and etc., also provided, is supposed to deliver nuclear submarines to Australia. Only 1 week later, we have had the first in-person meeting of the leaders of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue between the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. Again, the leaders have pledged to cooperate on infrastructure, cybersecurity, etc., and especially maritime security. What is interesting in this institutionalization of the Quad and also the announcement of AUKUS is that we see here partnerships that are, from my point of view, something that is new in nature. These partnerships are different from Cold War alliances in the sense that they are multidimensional, multifunctional, they are flexible, and they cover a wide array of issues in international politics. And therefore, I think, and I will introduce now the panelists, I think it's interesting to think about this partnership, why they have this shape. Is it because the Chinese challenge is by definition multidimensional and therefore requires multidimensional responses? Or is it because countries in the region actually do not want to confront frontally China and therefore entering partnerships that don't have a strong military dimension? Also, we will talk about the position other countries have of this partnership. We can talk about Japan, we can talk about South Korea, Europe, and other key countries like New Zealand, Canada. Okay? And then also, this begs the question of whether these partnerships are actually a phenomenon that will, I would say, polarize the Indo-Pacific region. We are always hearing in the news about a new Cold War. Is it the beginning of a new Cold War or not? And therefore, to talk about this very important topic, I have the pleasure to be joined today by 3 renowned panelists and scholars of international relations, which I will introduce. First, joining us from Washington, D.C. online, we have Bonnie Glaser. So Bonnie is the director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She is also a non-resident fellow with the Law Institute in Sydney and a senior associate with the Pacific Forum. She was previously Senior Advisor for Asia Center for Strategic and International Studies. And prior to joining CSIS in 2003, she served as a consultant for various US government offices, including the Department of Defense and the Department of State. On my left is Kazushige Kobayashi. He is a visiting lecturer at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva and a postdoctoral researcher at the Graduate Institute Center on Conflict, Development, and Peace Building. His current research focuses on global IR theory, peace building and conflict management, and the role of non-Western powers, especially Russia, Japan, and China, in the transformation of international orders. And finally, Michiel Foulon. He is a senior researcher on US-China relations and US green strategy towards China at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. His research focuses on the role of security and trade dynamics in American foreign policy, as well as international relations theory, with a focus on neoclassical realism. Now, just before giving the floor to Bonnie Glaser for her remarks, just a few housekeeping rules. Each panelist will give a talk for a maximum 10 minutes, and then we'll turn to a Q&A with the audience. I will give priority to those who are in the room. Okay. Thank you for coming here in person. And then, of course, we will switch to Zoom to see whether any questions are coming from the internet. So without further ado, Bonnie, you have the floor. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a privilege to join the Webster Geneva Global Dialogue. I will apologize in advance that I have to drop off about 10 minutes early. You in Europe have changed your clocks before we have in the United States. So the time of this moved on my calendar a bit. I was hoping that by the time this day arrived, that the Biden administration would have already issued the Indo-Pacific Strategy, which has been completed, I think, for a month or so, but has not yet been launched. But that has not happened. So we'll just have to guess something about what that Indo-Pacific Strategy is. So I'm going to talk about the objectives, lay out some of the assumptions of what I think are behind that strategy, some of the lines of effort, and then talk just a little bit about the challenges and shortcomings. So first of all, you may have seen there was a redacted, declassified version of the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific Strategy that was released while Trump is still in office. And I think you'll find if you compare the new Indo-Pacific Strategy of the Biden administration, although there are obviously some important differences, particularly in approaches and policies, I think that you will find that there are some similarities in terms of objectives. So the United States seeks to preserve and strengthen the rules-based liberal regional and international order. Strengthening ties with allies and partners is very high on the list of the Biden administration's objectives. There is, I think, a lot of ongoing consultation and coordination and cooperation with allies. Third objective is to prevent China from creating a sphere of influence in the region, from weakening US alliances, and from attaining regional hegemony. The fourth objective would be to prevent use of force against the United States and any of its allies and partners. And finally, advance American prosperity, security, and influence in the region. And that very much depends on maintaining free and open access to the region. So open access for trade has been an important goal of US strategy since the 18th century and remains so today. So let me lay out some of the assumptions behind the US Indo-Pacific Strategy. One is that strategic competition with China is likely to persist for many years to come, perhaps decades. This is a result of divergent political and economic systems, as well as conflicting interests in some key areas. A second assumption is that China is seeking to alter the regional and international order to make the rules and norms more advantageous to China, not necessarily overthrow the order, but to adjust it in ways that make it more favorable to Beijing's interests. Third is that China seeks to dominate cutting-edge technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing and autonomous vehicles. The assumption here is that if China were to achieve this goal, this would threaten free societies. There was just an announcement that was made by our intelligence agencies just last week about 6 core areas of technology that the United States must seek to remain dominant in, along with its Western allies. And then the fourth assumption is that the United States cannot shape China's choices and influence its decision-making alone. It must work together with like-minded nations. So even then, there are some areas in which it may be impossible to influence China's decision-making and policies. And in those areas, we need to work together with partners to defend our shared interests. So strong alliances are very much key to deterring conflict and advancing our vital interests in the region. So then moving on to some of the lines of effort. So I will quickly tick off, I think I have about 9 or 10. The first is the Quad, obviously started well over a decade ago, resuscitated by the Trump administration, but also being taken to new levels by the Biden administration. These are 4 democracies. The Quad is not explicitly anti-China, but it is motivated by concerns about China. The focus now is in 4 areas. It's on vaccines and climate and critical and emerging technologies. I think these are the main areas now. They are not security focused. There may be some focus on security going forward, but right now these 4 countries feel most comfortable working in those areas. A second line of effort is to further promote India's role in the region as a provider of security and a major defense partner. India obviously is the largest democracy, may soon actually be the most populated country in the world. It plays a very pivotal role and is the reason why we have shifted our nomenclature from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. Thirdly is to get countries vested in Taiwan's security and its prosperity, to persuade countries that their interests are linked to Taiwan's future, and to signal that a Chinese use of force could be very costly. So the goal here is to strengthen deterrence. And I think we have seen quite a bit of efforts along these lines with past June when President Biden visited Europe, and there were sentences about the need to preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait that were included in both the US-EU joint statement and the G7 joint communique. Another line of effort is to encourage like-minded countries to play a greater role in addressing regional challenges and stepping up to do more in burden sharing. This is true in North Korea on issues even like IUU fishing and in the Pacific Islands. Next is to create new security architecture and as has been already discussed. I mean, AUKUS is not just to create new nuclear submarines for Australia. It is intended to be new security architecture. The Quad is also intended to serve this purpose. AUKUS is focused on technology, R&D cooperation. It's designed to retain our collective military and defense edge, as well as to strengthen deterrence. Next is to work with allies and like-minded countries to prevent Chinese acquisition of strategic and military capabilities. The Trade and Technology Council is one example of this. There are growing concerns about China's military civil fusion program, and there, I think, will be more efforts on things like export controls to try and limit some advanced technologies to be spilling over into China's military capabilities. Next is to push back against China's human rights violations, its efforts to promote Chinese models of governance, to promote standards, and to insert Chinese socialist norms into the global order. Just a couple more lines of effort: balance against China in Southeast Asia and provide capacity building so that those countries have more freedom to maneuver and the ability to protect their own interests. And then finally, and importantly, to cooperate with China where our interests converge, where cooperation is possible. But as the Chinese saying goes, it takes two hands to clap. So the question is whether China is actually willing to cooperate with the United States. And so far, they have set preconditions of improvement in the relationship. And then finally, I will close just by listing some of the challenges and shortcomings of, from my perspective, of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. First is what I see as a very weak economic pillar. Domestic politics in the United States is really hampering the ability of the United States to even talk about joining multilateral trade agreements. So we've seen just in the last month, China has applied to join both the CPTPP and then as of just a few days ago, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement that New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile are part of. The United States is not part of either of these agreements, and so far there are no prospects of its joining. So I think the United States has really had one hand tied behind its back because it doesn't have an effective economic policy in the region. Second shortcoming is that I think we are still struggling to compete with China on setting higher standards for financing infrastructure in the region. We have been talking about competing with the Belt and Road now for over a decade, or about a decade. It was announced in, of course, 2013. So we've seen China's projects in the Belt and Road, some of them going well, probably more of them running into problems, especially since the onset of COVID. But that's not good news for countries that actually need the infrastructure. And the United States, I think, is still struggling with coming up with ways to provide infrastructure effectively, to work with other countries like Japan and Australia. There is a project in Palau, and I believe now there's one in Fiji, but this is very slow going. Third is slow progress in persuading countries outside the region to increase their involvement in the Indo-Pacific. So obviously with AUKUS, we've seen a big commitment by the UK, but we've had setbacks now, of course, with France as a result of AUKUS. I think there are still many European countries that aren't too clear whether their interests closely intersect with what is happening in the Indo-Pacific. The EU Indo-Pacific Strategy paper, I think, was a huge step forward, and we'll have to see, how that is pursued in the future. And then very last challenge and shortcoming is, will the creation of these new multilateral groupings like AUKUS and Quad, will they actually persuade China to moderate its behavior as they are intended to do, to push back against China's destabilizing policies? Will it have this intended effect, or will it result in China doubling down on its aggressive behavior? And if the latter is the outcome, then that will, of course, be another shortcoming of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I am not yet sure what the outcome is going to be, because this is still very much early days and a work in progress. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Vani. Thank you for this very, very comprehensive and at the same time extremely precise presentation and explanation of the US foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific. You highlighted the key pillars, also the shortcomings. And to make the transition with the second panelist, there is a point that you raised that is, for me, easy to bridge, is the importance of the United States working with like-minded countries, convincing other countries in Asia and beyond to participate to the effort. And therefore now I will give the floor to Kazushige Kobayashi to tell us about how other countries in the Indo-Pacific region perceive these US-led initiatives and partnerships. You have the floor.
Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm very impressed that you can pronounce my name perfectly, and even sometimes difficult for Japanese people. And so thank you for inviting me. Well, from my point of view, I will build on my previous speaker, and I point out that I think when it comes to regional partnerships in Asia, probably is the most important point is that it is the Asian security system or Asian system at its current format is more like the musical chair game, you know. There's the music going on, and when the moment comes, not everybody can sit on the same table. And by that, I mean that certain measures to enhance security cooperation with certain partners in the region can end up producing tensions for other partners. So let me illustrate this point by taking some concrete examples from Japan, South Korea, and India. Since I'm from Japan, I just start with Japan because it's maybe the easiest. But when it comes to Japan, Japan absolutely loves the idea of Quad and also AUKUS recently. Why? Because these platforms provide Japan as a perfect opportunity to express and demonstrate its unyielding commitment to American-led security system in the Asian region without doing anything very concrete. That is the point. That without provoking China or without provoking anybody else, without providing financial aid to any other country, Japan can demonstrate its commitment to American hegemony. That is a very important point from Japan. Also, in terms of domestic politics, these groupings are very important because in the context of AUKUS and Quad, there is a narrative of China threat. And this China threat narrative is very important for Japanese nationalists and conservatives. As you know, we just had an election a few days ago. Well, a few days ago, yes. And the main party won. The main party always win. But many of the conservative nationalists and also the nationalist parties, such as the Japan Restoration Party, they won a big seat this time. Now I think in total they control around 300 in the ruling party, and if we add this conservative party together, maybe 310, 315, something like that. But a lot of Japanese nationalists use the China threat narrative to push for revision of the constitution, which was created by the United States after 1945. And this morning, I already saw some of the nationalist politicians started to call for the revision of the Japanese constitution. They say that that constitution was created 7 decades ago. It is outdated. It is not able to meet the challenge of security threat posed by China. It is time to, fundamentally revise it. And that's why this China narrative is very convenient and profitable for Japanese politicians who want to seek these domestic agendas. And this is also exactly why some of Japan's regional neighbors, such as South Korea, tend to downplay or de-emphasize the China threat narrative because they are afraid that Japanese politicians will use this China threat narrative as an opportunity to push for historical revisionism. That is already happening. And in that sense, the total absence of South Korea in AUKUS and in Quad demonstrates the complexity of the Asian security system. And why they are not there? Because in recent years, there has been rising tension between South Korea and Japan. Well, there was always tension, but in recent years, there are more tensions. We didn't think it was possible to have more tension, but somehow it's possible. In recent years, South Korea has also upgraded their bilateral relationship with Russia and China. They're closely interacting, even though they are not allies. And South Korea is still American ally. But for South Korea, the major security challenge is Japanese revisionism, or at least they think it that way. When it comes to public discourses, and they are very afraid that, for example, if the United States or Western powers, UK, Australia, start deepening their security partnership with Japan, this will enable Japan to pursue historical revisionist ideas that was totally discredited in 1945. Usually, 100 years ago, or maybe 70 years ago, the idea was that Japan is the cornerstone of Asian security, countering China, countering Russia, the greatest empire of the world. That was how Japanese empire was fashioned. We can remember 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance, it was like that. So that's exactly why South Korea feels alienated by Western effort to promote Japanese activism in the region. And this also deepens the fragmentation of the Asian security system. And finally, before I stop talking, The last point I want to emphasize is the role of other important players like India and Russia. So now we briefly talked about India, but India is a major military strategic partner of Russia. Much part of Indian military hardware, also sometimes training, come from Russia. And India has been upgrading its relationship with Russia since 2014. And it was actually Russia which very strongly pushed for the inclusion or the mission of India as an official member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That is a multilateral security organization in US. Yeah? Even though China opposed it to the India's inclusion, it was Russia who pushed it. Why? Because for Russia, India is a kind of gateway to Asia, right? And this is where India's participation in Quad comes. It is beneficial for Russia because through engagement with India, Russia can learn much about Quad activities, intentions, policies, etc. I mean, they don't need to spy for it, but they can learn a lot of it from India's participation. And also, Russia remains assured by the fact that India participates in Quad. Because there's India, there will be no interventionism. That's by having India at the Quad, Russia can stay assured that it will not be turning into any kind of anti-Chinese alliance. That is why India plays a very important role in that sense. And lastly, even though China and India have many problems, such as border disputes, China and India also advance certain common positions. When it comes to Syria, when it comes to Libya, they are almost united in advancing anti-interventionist policies. And today, I think they're having COP26. Also, India, China, they play a very important role in uniting developing countries to stand up against what they call as a Western imposition of the arbitrary constraints on economic activities. So that's how they see it. So even though there are a lot of tensions between India and China, we cannot really see them in the binary confrontation because depending on how you cut it, but there are sometimes cooperation, sometimes competition. And that's why, to conclude and reiterate my previous point, that's why I portray the Asian security system or the Asian cooperation system as the current form is more like the musical chair. The attempt to deepen partnership with one partner will end up alienating others. If you pursue deeper cooperation with Japan, South Korea will be unhappy. If they try to militarize AUKUS or Quad, India will be unhappy. That's why it's very difficult to balance of these partners. And that's why I think perhaps for future research or future food for thought, we really need to think not in terms of balancing as a kind of China-US rivalry, but also internal balancing, the sense of balancing different partners, different priorities. I think so far the United States has done a great job in balancing, and that's why the forms of the Quad and AUKUS are like that, I think, at the moment. But I think this demonstrates the complexity of the Asian system. But that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kazu. Extremely interesting, and I like the allegory of the musical chairs. So very good. We knew about the karaoke diplomacy now. Yeah. Okay. Reference to that. Very interesting. And I think you pinpointed two things that I think are central here. Is the complexity of international relations in this region intrinsically, not only about between Japan and South Korea for historical and political reasons, but much beyond. And I think it is a warning against us taking a Manichaean view of this region with the camp and the other camp and etc. You mentioned typically India and China cooperate too, right? Even though there are border disputes and there is still the Ladakh problem and etc. And also, and here a perfect bridge with Michael is about, you mentioned domestic politics, which is good because sometimes as IR scholars, we tend to forget that there is domestic politics. And as Michael is a specialist in neoclassical realism and therefore involved
about continuity and change. So we see some change going on in strategy, some change going on also in means being deployed, more multilateral or more confrontation in the Trump administration, but also some continuity across administration when it comes to the goals of the strategy and so forth. Even though in the heat of the elections very often and the polarization with the Republicans and Democrats, often it is kind of overshadowed this continuity, and it's even funny from Europe to see sometimes that there is so much continuity across parties that it's all the same. And that it is interesting. Oliver Stone documentary a while ago when he asked Putin what he thinks about Obama, and Putin says it's an American president. So continuity and change, I think, is an interesting starting point for me to put this debate about the Indo-Pacific strategy in a broader context. For me, this is part of this broader issue, and also the recent incident between France and AUKUS about the submarines deal is also part of that. So I want to focus a bit more on the broad term and the broader trends on this debate. So now, of course, it matters what this means for European states, how they should respond, what made the problems for them to respond, what are their positions on this debate. So in my remaining comments, I will address three issues briefly. One of them is on the military dimension, then something briefly on the trade dimension, and then something about how Europe should respond and what the positions may be there. So of course, there is too much to discuss, so I'll select a few of those issues which I think are sufficiently broad to at least have some idea. So on the military side of things, one of the main debates, of course, in Europe is should, and if so, how should Europe carry more of the burden in the transatlantic alliance? And if so, how can Europe do so? That is, of course, a debate going on in academic research and journals too. And the interesting thing, of course, is to see that there is this super great power of the US, which still has this kind of super high debt levels, resource constraints, defense budget cuts in the Obama administration, despite some increases in the Trump administration, and that US will be unlikely to fight at two theaters at the same time in the future. And as of course, this kind of idea that the US is trying to aim to say, well, we may be able to fight in the future in one theater, let's say East Asia, but maybe not fully engage at the same, but maybe determined not fully engage in other, let's say, Europe. But also, of course, with the context that matters a lot to Europeans too in the debate whether they should carry more of the burden and look after more for their security. So one of the arguments that are now getting more established is that Europe should ensure more and look more after its own security, which doesn't mean it should become this kind of superpower military in military terms, but at least that it should augment its capabilities so it can deter some aggressor sufficiently long until there will be help from other alliances from outside and so forth. So it's a bit more of a nuanced debate, but at least to do something more along those lines. A second point behind the military that I want to address is something about trade, and of course also the France AUKUS incident over the submarines deals, which I think raise very broad questions for Europe too. Is this incident, which is a trade deal basically, a one-off incident that happened and faced and confronted Europe, or is it something that European states may face more in the future? As there's of course a big debate in and a lot of research for decades going on in academia about the trade implications of security partnerships. Talk about the Quad and about the AUKUS and so on, security partnerships. There's of course decades-old literature and still ongoing today that says yes, there is a positive correlation that trade occurs more within partners from a security partnership and as with states outside of it. And there's also theoretical arguments for this kind of thing. So looking at this kind of incidents from the from AUKUS and France and the submarines deal, the question could be, well, is this a one-off thing, or can we also expect more of this in Europe in the future? So does trade follow the flag? Do states states do more of these things in the future and so forth? So it may also be important to think for Europeans what this means for them on the longer term. Was it a one-off incident, or will it be more like this? Seminal works, of course, also stress this kind of role that you have to think about these things more structurally. There may be a trend that there may be more of this going on. So its recent partnerships with the US, the Quad, the AUKUS, happening in the broader context, the pivot, the reorientation, this longer trend, one may or one could have already, based on those that existing research, expect or anticipate that trade patterns would also shift. So the AUKUS France deal in that sense and the incident may be a data point of a potentially term that we should have actually been seeing and so forth. So if that is the case, and if security partnerships are intensifying between US and non-European states, as for example AUKUS and for the UK and the Quad are illustrating, then what occurred between France and AUKUS may be regarding the deal for submarines, maybe something that European states may face more in the future. It's futurology, we don't know, but there is some research indicating that correlations exist. that theoretical arguments exist, are data points, that is quantitative historical data by decades ago, Joan Coe and Briston and so on. So there is some argument at least to think critically about this in Europe. So the challenge I think here is both in policy research and also in theoretical research that yes, we know, or we at least there is some agreement in literature that there's a correlation that there is more trade or tends to be trade over time between security partners and less with people outside the security partnership. But why? What are the conditions under which that this occurs, like this incident now with France and AUKUS? Of course, the question there is we should know why and under which conditions this happens, which in my reading of literature and the research doesn't exist yet, this argument. Why does this happen and when? Because only when we know when can Europeans or policymakers in general start to think more strategically about these things. Without knowing why this happens, we don't really know and can't really help that. So I think that's, I think, for me an interesting point from what I learned from what I thought of the France AUKUS submarine incident. The final point I want to address is something about European positions and European strategy. So given if this is a context that is confronting Europe, what should it be doing? How should it be responding? What are the challenges and what are maybe diverging positions of them? So of course, one issue also mentioned by Lionel when he introduced me is it's very complex to talk about Europe. You talk about EU, you talk about Europe, supranational, intergovernmental, federal, and so forth and so forth. So differing positions are not very unusual. One of the current debates, I think, is also different positions on trade issues, where the Netherlands may be very concerned that nationalism and being tough against China and US may hurt the Netherlands as a trade powerhouse. France and Germany may be much more in favor, especially now, also to take firmer action both against US and against China. In other domains too, like cyber, what are the positions of the states about norms like sovereignty? Some countries are sticking more strictly to sovereignty as a rule. Other European states, like UK, I believe, say, well, cyber actions into another country's domain or systems are not necessarily a violation of sovereignty. So that the very divergent positions, of course, an important challenge that I think remains. One thing that I learned myself in the past few months, is that a question about strategic culture and strategic thinking and hard power realist thinking, to what extent that is sufficiently there in European policy thinking. It is emerging, it is changing. European policymakers have become to show more signs of that strategic realist hard power thinking. German Chancellor Angela Merkel back then said that US can no longer fully rely on the United States. Macron said NATO is brain dead and so forth. European states, large and small, are becoming more aware also in their strategic documents. Germany's 2030 strategy argues that they should keep trade, supply chains within the EU and not always outside and depend on others. Even smaller states like Belgium having their first ever national security strategy later this year, where in the brainstorm sessions where I also joined there was clearly this kind of increase in thinking strategically, competition-wise, hard power-wise, and so forth. That was an interesting exercise, I think. So lack of strategic thinking, perhaps, but I think some things are changing there too. And then my final comment would be that I've written also elsewhere that for me at least, and also that's my own viewpoint, I've written elsewhere in the policy perspective for the Center for Security Studies at ETH, that Europe on the one hand should strive to maintain or revise an existing little system, that maintains and is still in favor of its interest, at the same time not ignore and embrace a version of economic nationalism, which is of course not too much at the same time, but at least some versions should not ignore these voices, which are often very rightful voices when they come about job losses and this kind of thing, security concerns about 5G and so forth. So a combination of revising the liberal international system, but also embracing a certain form of economic nationalism. So both when it comes to process issues, process like treaties, conventions, norms that I can establish with the US, when it comes to, for example, the use of new technologies, and also specific trade issues, Airbus, Boeing, beef, and so forth. So a combination of maintaining a system, revising, and then embracing a healthy version of economic nationalism. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Well, very interesting that, well, you mentioned the two-theater dilemma. I mean, the world is big, but clearly there is a view that everything is interconnected. And that somehow, given the rise of challengers or the re-emergence of countries like Russia, the Western countries will have to somehow have a division of labor somehow. And it's also very interesting. You mentioned about somehow the wake up of Europe after the dream of the post-Cold War era and the European integration. And you mentioned about the fact that, well, you have a strategic thinking that is now pervading inside Europe, not only in military dimension, but also trade. But also that you see divisions inside Europe on all these issues, whether we should confront China, whether we should privilege good relationship because of economic relationship, and etc. In other words, interesting because we see that in the two different regions we have talked about today, Indo-Pacific and Europe, everything is in flux. So somehow everything is open, which is a huge headache for the people like us, who sometimes are asked by journalists to basically predict what will happen 5 years ahead. In other words, the game is open. And this is also this way that I will open the floor for questions. Bunny will have to leave in less than, in about 5 minutes. So if there is any question in the room for Bunny, this is now, please. We have, many.
If you can stand up and just speak loudly for a question.
Hi, my name is Arnold. I'm a senior student here. I'm a minor in international relations. I just have a question concerning the Indo-Pacific region, the partnerships. How much influence do the Asian nations have in preventing China's rise?
So you mean compared to the agency of the United States?
Yes.
Okay. So what is the margin of maneuver of US allies in somehow impacting Washington's policy?
Yes.
Bonnie?
Well, thank you for the question. As I said in my opening remarks, I think that the United States really can't shape China's choices by itself. So it really does need to work with other countries. And it is the willingness of countries to join coalitions on different issues. And this is not going to be like the Cold War, where we had one coalition of countries that was opposing the Soviet Union. There may be one group of countries that is interested in pushing back against China's human rights policies. There might be another grouping that is really interested in protecting supply chains. So I think this will be much more complicated, but I think that other countries have a great deal of agency in this process. I would say that if there is one thing that China does fear, it is the formation of these anti-China coalitions. And so I think this is very much a work in progress. It's too early to say whether it is going to have the positive impact that we hope that it will have. But I think that's the goal. It is not containment of China's rise. The goal is not to prevent China from reemerging as a great power. The goal is to ultimately influence China's policies so that they will moderate them and be more supportive of the regional and international order rather than playing a destabilizing role. I'll be happy to take one more question. Can I do the Taiwan question?
Oh, you saw it. Perfect. I was about to mention it. So please, if you're ready for that, please.
Yeah, I'll be short and then I'll have to go. But the question is really about China's actions with respect to Taiwan and whether some of the recent announcements like AUKUS have provoked China's actions. So I think it's really important to put China's actions in coercing Taiwan in the context of a much longer history. Obviously, the Civil War continues since 1949, but more importantly, since Tsai Ing-wen came to power in 2016, we have seen economic pressure on Tsai, the cutting of tourists that are going to Taiwan. That started in 2016. We then saw 8 different diplomatic partners being taken from Taiwan. And then in March of 2019, Chinese aircraft deliberately crossed the center line of the Taiwan Strait for the first time in 20 years. So if you're just coming to the headlines of the Taiwan problem and see 150 aircraft happened to be in the air defense identification zone in over a 3-day period, I would certainly encourage you to look sort of more broadly at what's been going on. And these aircraft, by the way, are flying in international airspace. They're not in Taiwan's defense zone. They're certainly not flying over Taiwan. But I think really one important point to make is that China is not necessarily reacting to something that the United States or Taiwan is doing in every one of these cases. So I've had people from the PLA tell me, for example, that sometimes these flights of aircraft in the ADIZ are intended to signal, but other times they are intended for training. And Xi Jinping has been telling the PLA to conduct more realistic training. So they're testing Taiwan's defenses. They are stressing Taiwan's Air Force. They're certainly trying to instill a sense of psychological despair in Taiwan, which I think is an objective that Beijing has. And they would like to warn Taiwan not to cross China's red lines. So I think they have a series of objectives, and they're not always reacting to the latest thing that the US or Taiwan is doing. And with that, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Bunny. Have a good afternoon in DC. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye. All right. So any other question on Zoom or in the room?
Hi.
Yes, Angelina.
That's the mic.
So my question is that even though India has right now the largest democracy and it improved its relations with Russia and we started doing something with China, does India still right now strive to prevent the emergence of a dominant power in this vast portion of the globe?
Who wants to take it? Yes, you can.
Yeah, even though I'm not an India specialist, well, I think for now, India's policy is to balance between different forces, right? Not to commit itself to any specific party. And that I think was a smart strategy. And if you look at, India's Indo-Pacific Strategy paper, half of it is about Africa, right? That's also what people fail to notice. It is also, if you look at Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if you go to Japanese Indo-Pacific Strategy, half of it, left side, is Africa, right? And this is also one of the ways to frame their, not adventurism, but engagement with Africa, that when United States talk about Indo-Pacific, it is mostly the Pacific or American Pacific, I don't know, Hawaii Pacific, this kind of region. But that's also why this concept is fungible and useful for different partners. Right? Because for India and also Japan, when they talk about Indo-Pacific, they have very strong emphasis on Africa with engagement. This also has to do with non-alignment, mutual aid, mutual cooperation, unit cooperation. And that's why, from what I can see, I think for now, or maybe for a long time, India's policy is not to have any commitment to any specific security partner, but to have multiple options. It's like a portfolio. The strength of portfolio in economic theory comes from diversification. Not being committed to any specific investment, that's a strength. If you put your all eggs in one basket, then you're basically done. And that's, I think, how India is doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. So Australia put all its eggs in the same basket, AUKUS?
Well, in my view, I think what is interesting about Australia was that I was surprised they did it, but they lost a lot of economic profit, and who filled it up? It was Canada, US, Japan, right? Have you seen the trade statistics? Exports from United States and Canada and to China went up like 50%, 60% for many products this year, because Australia was spearheading whatever they do. I mean, they have every right to do so, it's their country. I do not interfere into another country's affairs. But this is also the complexity, right? Because maybe Australia thought that they will be leading this way, but Japan or South Korea, United States and Canada, especially business sector, will react in such a way to make up for the loss of certain other countries. That's also, I think, is part of the complexity.
Thank you. Any other question? Abdulaziz?
Good evening. I would have said morning. Bonnie just left us. I had a question for her, but I'd like with the panelists, if they can, to please answer it. So Madam Pony actually mentioned quite a few, I'd say, astonishing points. One of them being that the US is actually wanting to not suppress China's growth and not infringe it, but look over the certain violations. For example, she mentioned human rights and stuff, but simultaneously, wouldn't it be a bit hypocritical for the US having violated so many human rights, even let's say in the recent history? I'm sorry, that is a bit subjective, but so and another question for Mr. Fulon is that, so if one country has a certain image and they go against their, for example, if I mention just the human rights part, how would that element be implied in the domestic politics of, for example, the US? People can say that, oh wow, the parties of the US has already committed such atrocious acts. Why are they still in power? We don't want democracy and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, I'm making myself a bit more complex, but the bottom line is, how does all of this impact the domestic politics of US and its ability to trade with other countries and have a dialogue with them on certain issues? Thank you.
Thanks very much. So if I get the bottom line, as you mentioned, how does all of this, what we discussed, affect domestic politics and its ability to and so forth? Yeah, I think it's a great question. One of the ways I think to look at this would be to see how this evolved over time. A while ago, I was looking at statistics of, I think from the Pew Research Center, of the position of Americans towards free trade initiatives. And that's actually, I was thinking it was going to be declining, that it was declining over the past few years, but actually it has been increasing. There has been an increasing support for free trade initiatives on the one hand. At the same time, at policy level, at Congress level, there is of course this increasing consensus of a hardening stance on trade issues. But these things not always align or influence and so forth one another. So coming back to the continuity and change thing, the striking things, of course, is that, as also Bonnie mentioned, end goals remains the same across administrations and also across what sometimes the population wants, but the means tend to differ depending on the election's outcome. So you see the more confrontational unilateral approach of Trump, and you see the more multilateral approach of the Biden administration. But in a way, the goal remains the same, and sometimes the means to an extent also sometimes there is, even on the campaign website of Biden, there was a famous quote when he said, I will never ever, or I will never enter in a free trade agreement unless I've invested enough in the American workers to compete in the global economy. So it is very clear, there's a very clear protectionist agenda and so forth. So affecting domestic things, certainly, yeah. Some things are sometimes, I think, surprising. There's been an increase, according to some data, for support in the US for free trade initiatives. But then again, the question is to what extent, not to bring a very heavy term in the whole thing, but how much agency is there for an individual actor like a state or a president and so forth. If we see these structural changes happening that we have been discussing and so forth. Of course, my view is that there is less room for maneuver for the domestic things to influence, but over term anyway, we'll see this happening. Maybe some small divergence left and right on the means and so forth, but for me, the longer term, it remains quite similar. But a final point that might be to say that is we can endlessly talk about how structural things influence domestic things, right? One of the very interesting research areas, I think, is an interesting book. I think it's by Stephen Lobel on agrarian strategy and domestic lobby groups or something like that. And it's about how a rising power affects international trade routes, like also we talked about before, and therefore also the interest of domestic lobby groups in other state countries. Like if you're a free trade oriented country, you don't want to pay more insurances because your ship has to go way around because they're fighting somewhere or whatever. And these lobby groups then push more for a particular policy with the government. So it's kind of circle going around a rising power. Something happens in a conflict, it influences the interest of a domestic economic lobby group or industry. They have pressure for so this thing. There are many ways I think to see how this can affect these things, but I think I'm coming back to the first point I mentioned about continuity across administrations, but it's a great question. Thank you very much.
So Abdulaziz, you have to study neoclassical realism.
I didn't say that.
No, but you implied. And I agree. Celia, we have a question online.
Yes, absolutely.
Nicholas?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. I have two questions, if that's all right. My first question is, it's been mentioned a few times about building India's capacity in the Indo-Pacific region. Ms. Glauser mentioned part of the Indo-Pacific strategy would be building India as a security force in the region. However, geographically, India is more or less cut off from the region by China, by Myanmar and the South China Sea. So can India really have an influence, especially an influence to challenge China if it's cut off this way? And my second question is related to something Ms. Glauser said. She said that these were anti-China coalitions, but also the goal was not to destabilize China. So for the panelists, would you consider these coalitions, AUKUS, the Quad, to actually be anti-China coalitions? And do you think that will make China more dangerous because it feels threatened? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicholas. So maybe Kazu, you could take the one on India,
Yeah.
and Michael, the second one, please.
Thank you for the question. Well, I think India does not have a capacity to challenge China, or I don't think they have intention to do it. But even when they do, this is where the obviously ecology matters, right? So it is not about Indo-China relations. Do you remember when there was a border dispute flaring up? It was a few months ago, it was last year. It's relatively quickly receded. Why? Because when that happens, Moscow comes in the middle, Russia comes in. That maybe China is dissatisfied with what India does, but China has to care about Russia, and Russia tells China that you cannot, behave crazy. That's also what happened to India. That when India wants to pull up something against China, Russia is India's main military power and main military partner. So India has to think about what Russia will think about the action. And this is a very interesting, not triangle relationship, right? It was kind of like a interesting friendship, right? So even when China and India cannot talk to each other because they're fighting war for, 5 hours or something, they still talk to Moscow, right? So it's like a middleman. That's how Russia exercises influence in the region. Basically, that China may not care about what Indians think, but they have to care about what Russians think. And if Russians are not happy, then China has to rethink about it. And this is one of the indirect ways where India can influence. Maybe India has influence on China indirectly through Russia, because flaring up of China in the competition will definitely displease Russia, which is main military supplier in India, so they cannot do that. So I think this is why we need to go beyond this binary bilateral relationship to have context. We need to contextualize these competitions. It is not about China fighting America or India fighting China. It is much broader than that, I think, and that's why some kind of relational approach is very important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great question. So anti-China coalition, is that the case? AUKUS Quad. So of course, I don't think there's any agreement on qualifying it. Of course, our job is to interpret words, all about interpretation and meaning and so forth. My short answer would be yes. But I think it's a bit more nuanced. You can discuss about, of course, the term anti or whether it's just focused on China and so forth. But my short answer, my longer answer is, so I'm saying yes, just based on how I read material, so strategic documents, autobiographies, what they say and so forth. First of all, it's a bit of a question what you look for. Do you want somebody, do you only think it's an anti-China coalition when you hear somebody say those words, those lines? I think I remember a quote from the biography from Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, when she said something along those vague lines like, yeah, all of us in the room knew which country we're talking about, or something like that. So we're talking about cooperation with Vietnam and so on. So it depends a bit on what kind of data and support you look like, but for me, there is, I would qualify it as such, yes, you can debate the term anti and so on, or center those and focus on. But then again, if others won't agree with that, that's research, and they're quoting other sources, interviews with decision makers, and they say it was never about China, the TPP or the pivot or the AUKUS, it's not all about that and so forth. So data interpretation, for me, the balance was strong in favor of the case, but others may not agree with that. And of course, I think it's a question, as you do research, you first say, what am I going to look for? What kind of evidence do I want to see? Do you say yes or no? A pattern of behavior, or actually somebody saying those words, patterns of behavior? Look at the map and where the US military bases are. That is a quite clear picture. I think there's a few US military personnel in Hong Kong or something, just for some harbor labor and so forth. It's a quite clear pattern, strategic documents, or you look for statements. But short answer was for me, yes, based on the material that I read, and it's for me a clear story, but others may, of course, disagree on that.
Thank you so much. I will tend to agree. I will tend to agree with you. We came to the end of this conference. Sorry for those who could not ask questions.
Okay, we have another question here and another online if we have time and if the speakers are willing.
So the speaker are with.
All right. Can I also have one more?
No. Okay. So who wants to take the floor online?
It's Nicholas again.
Nicholas, okay, follow up.
Sorry, I'm very interested in the topic, but my question then is, it's related to the anti-China coalitions and such. I would understand why the US would want to stop China's rise in terms of ideological differences, not wanting to be unseated as the main hegemonic power, but for other countries in the region, not taking into account the US, why would China's growing sphere of influence, China's rise, be very dangerous?
And if I can add something to the question of Nicholas, we have a few countries we have not mentioned about, Southeast Asian countries, which is a bit related. So if somebody can talk about that, because this is central. Kazu, Maria.
Okay. Well, I think the question if China is dangerous is quite subjective matter, right? In case of Japan, China has to be dangerous to advance certain domestic. If China is not dangerous, then we don't get profit. That's how it is constructed, I think, especially when it comes to domestic politics. Same for South Korea. Japan has to be revisionist. It is not a question of if Japan is revisionist. Japan has to be revisionist for certain domestic politics to work. And that's how I see in the United States, that for many policy makers or coalitions or fundraisers or whatever they are, for them, China has to be revisionist, aggressive power for the domestic politics works. And yeah, that's how I think it is.
I'll follow up with a very brief follow-up on the, why it seemed to be threatening and dangerous and so forth. Of course, I could give a standard answer from the literature by saying the typical narrative goes, oh, there's a rising power, that there's a fear that in the future that rising power may use its increased capabilities against other states' interests and so forth. So that's a common narrative of why a rising power in the past, whatever, Napoleon, France, Germany, China, whatever, you know, other seen, because in the future they may use that power against you. But that's a common narrative, right? That is an interesting term, of course, and was a good point being made before about being subjective, about it increases a fear in other states' mind that it may use, that the rising power may act against them with fear, minds, interpretation, meaning, and so forth. So you kind of inevitably, for me, end up with a material reality, rising power, geography, hard power, and so forth, but also with meaning and interpretation and so forth. What does make people concerned more about one and not about the other country and so forth? That's, of course, and I heard the term construction here before and so forth, and that's also narratives, discourse, and so, of course, play also there. So why is the case? I think you'll have to look into those kind of debates, both empirical and policy-wise, why people say those things, what influences whatever group thinking and so on. Yeah. But also just, you know, how do you think the world works, basically. You think it's based on material things, and it doesn't make a lot of sense why the US isn't the most trending and so forth, and why, or do you think it's mainly based on ideas and so forth? It's a first year international relations introduction topic, of course, but nevertheless, I think it's hugely important here. I think it's hard to maintain to make an objective statement there. You have to think about along those lines. So that I think would be my shortcut answer of touching on the topic.
Very good. And by the way, this put into question the rationality assumption, which is the basis of many of the paradigms of IA we have. So clearly perception, and I will say culture, going beyond perception, so culture can be important in terms of how you perceive the world. We have a last question.
Yes. Me?
No,
Oh.
it's me. Okay, so combine it.
Actually, my question is related to the first you had.
Okay, please, Abdulaziz, and then
Thank you very much.
Okay, so for Kobayashi and Kike-san, I have a question that, so with the change of the elected party in a certain country, the allies, how they feel, it changes. So from Japan and the Japanese specialist as yourself, what do you think is the current positioning of Japan on how it feels on the Biden administration with respect to the Trump administration? And as Madam Glazer, she mentioned that the inability to push forward the Indo-Pacific strategy, how does Japan feel? And with a follow-up question, sorry, for Mr. Full, Mr. Kobayashi mentioned that, well, trading with certain countries can lead to the alienation, like trading more or interacting more with certain countries can lead to the alienation of certain other countries. So all of this, which is happening right now, do you think as a neoclassical realist yourself can trigger certain counter coalitions in the foreseeable future, be it small, if you take China out of the picture? Thank you very much.
Well, I think when it comes to Japanese foreign policy, there's one and only one principle, which is to follow America. No questions asked. That's how it operates. But we also need to remember that 1991, George Friedman, he was former CIA analyst. Now he has his own company for strategic forecasting, Strat4. Maybe you know it sometimes. It was half years ago, now it's okay. But 1991, he published a book. You can Google it if you want. The title was The Coming War with Japan. So what we see with China today is very much a repetition of the discourse of 1980. Japan was the greatest threat, right? So when Japan bought Empire State Building in New York, when Japan was allegedly doing mercantilist policy to impoverish America, to have trade dispute, to steal intellectual property, Japan was the greatest threat. In 1992, Samuel Huntington published an article in International Security, which was called Why Primacy Matters, where he said, America need to keep primacy, Japan is the greatest threat, we need to counter no matter what. And that was kind of a discourse, right? So Japan also remembers that. And that, I think, is a delicate balance that we have in Japan, that especially the older politicians, even though they want to mobilize this anti-China narrative, they also remember themselves that Japan was a threat itself to America, not to the world, to America. Can you imagine that? We had no intention of being threatening, but somehow we are threat. So that's what I see when I talk to Japanese policymakers. They have this sentimental dilemma when it comes to China, that they want to construct a narrative of threat, but they also have this bitter memory of constructed of the threat. So it is more like a yin-yang dialectics in Chinese ancient language. You know, you have light, you have darkness, darkness becomes light, light becomes darkness, and nothing ends there. So I stop here.
Thanks very much for the interesting question. I've never thought about it, to be fair, so I'm just going to say whatever comes to mind, which is not going to be much sensible, perhaps, but it's an interesting question because usually people think the other way around, right? You know, often people prioritize security and then all the secondary things follow, trade and human rights and whatever. Unless, of course, you're political economists like Robert Gilpin or whatever, or Gansky and so on. They start with economics things and then you may start, okay, maybe behavior is first and foremost founded on trade aspect, not so much on security things. You know, the first, the famous quote from Mearsheimer in his book is, you know, you can only trade when you're alive, so you have to think about security first, basically. So if you think from that point, and trade won't be affected because you think first about security concerns. I think there's a lot of arguments. I didn't think about this on my argument, but just some literature there. I think that you can dig into. I think it's called the Trade Security Nexus literature. We talk about this link between those things. It often discusses first security and then what I mentioned before, how trade should follow the security flag or the coalition. But there is a lot of stuff going on with recent work on power transition theory based on, for example, Robert Kilpin and so on. And these things, I'm just trying to, put some seeds where maybe something interesting can follow, because they tend to start by explaining behavior of countries changes when political and economic variables change. Well, all the other ones, like myself too, often think it's for security concerns. So maybe these are some seeds that may help to grow something. But I think it's an interesting question.
Thank you so much. And I think that you remember them, you reminded them the nightmare of a current exam on Gilpin. But it's all. Antonina, last question.
Yes, Abdul mentioned about the domestic policies, and I would like to ask a question on that. So my question is, should the US temporarily avoid involvement in all the contests of the European and especially Asian world in order to start working on the domestic policy? Because comparing to China initially had no need to go abroad and discover a world that was already considered ordered. So should it do it, or is there a huge risk of, for example, the security dilemma emerging and the arms race and high tensions between China and the US?
Retrenchment, the whole debate.
Well, I think just because domestic politics in America is difficult, there should be China's threat. There's one thing that President Trump and President Biden agree, that is China's threat, right? So maybe China's threat is one last thing that's keeping America together. And that's why people say when the polarization happens, America is declining, and then maybe they will not stand up to China. I think it's contrary. Because American politics is polarized, there has to be China's threat to keep the country unified. And I think that's how it works. But any kind of anti-China coalition will not be anti-China coalition unless they include Russia, right? Because the only way the United States can win more military conflicts against China in the long run is to have Russia's backing, so that China will be facing two-front war. So by dividing Russia and China, this is a maximum strategy to put pressure on China. But that's why China is becoming more aggressive after 2014, not only because of Xi Jinping, but because Russia is completely and fundamentally alienated from the European theater. That Russia has no choice to back China, right? So Russia cannot be bought, cannot be seduced, whatever. So that's how China can keep confidence that no matter what happens, Russia will be still back in China. And in that case, China will never lose kind of significant defeat, because they can always retreat and regroup and, defight. So yeah, that's how I think.
Interesting, very interesting question. Thank you very much. Just some first brief thoughts. Retrenchment, restraint. I think we can never discuss this enough, because there is so many billions and miles, whatever. So it's really, I think, it's still very lively this debate today. I think much of that, of course, revolves around Barry Posner's restraint book, and these things are often kind of the navigation, the gravitational point of these debates and so forth. Interesting question. Should or can, so your question was more prescriptive, should they, and all the question would be can they, and so forth, because I think the should depends on the can. They should only do so if they can. If they can't, then there's no point in, and so forth. And I think two issues come to mind there. One of them is domestic culture and then resource constraints. Domestic culture meaning a culture of international liberalism, for example. To what extent has that in the past already led to overextension? To what extent is that still there? If it is the case, then it might be very difficult, and so forth. But then again, culture might also change, of course, depending on a lot of issues. One of them might be an awareness, which awareness creates minds and whatever, of things like research constraints, debts, budget cuts, and so forth, which we, of course, have been seeing in the past few years too. The last episode with the Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal. It's so funny to see how they debate about $5 billion in the Congress over some bill. Then they spend 3,000 billion in the Middle East, whatever. So I think, can they? Domestic culture is an important aspect. If it's still pressing so much for that international liberal stuff, then it may be very difficult. But I think the resource constraint, and that's my viewpoint, and that also in my research, is that's kind of inevitable. You have this kind of, the culture is an ideational thing in your mind, or something that exists out there, which is very mutable and can change in a way, basically very quickly. But material constraints, not having the coins, not having the tanks, not having and so forth, or not having enough, is kind of inevitable. You can't socially construct one more tank or one less tank or whatever. So for me, this kind of resource constraint on longer term is anyway inevitable. And I'm just thinking about, I think a few years ago, I forgot which year, the US credit status changed from AAA to AA, I believe. I don't know what it is today. It's so funny to think about US, we never go bankrupt and so forth. And so it's so funny to see this country going from AAA to AA, high debt levels, resource constraints. So I think this kind of, I make a distinction between the cultural, the ideational cultural things that push, but they may be changing, that may realize to replace academia and think tanks. Yes, we have to change and restrain. It can also compel to, because these material constraints of resources that they are lacking are inevitable. You can't go around those things. So that would be my kind of twofold response.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, a last one. I'll do that. Okay.
Hi, my name is Samuel Lee. I'm a 3-time master's graduate from Webster University. Okay. Looking at this, I love what Kobayashi has said. Exactly kind of thing, the mentality. It is easy to criticize other countries for what we have done. You know, ever since World War II, the big countries have occupied everywhere. We look at Japan as a threat, but today we are friends. Rather than looking at China as a threat, we should look at China, how to include. China was a sick country. Only 30 years ago, it started to turn around. The progress is so great that it might frighten us. So did Japan. But we managed to include Japan. The challenge is not to see China as a threat, but China as an inclusion in the development of all our countries, India, China, Africa. This is where it is. The difference between how we did it before, the UK, Belgium, Netherlands, and all that, we don't colonize. The Chinese do not colonize. They have always been invited. All they did was focusing on their country, and that's how Japan did it. Japan's focus is only the country. Who has the best passport in the world? Which country? Japan. Why? Because Japan goes and negotiates, goes and talks. There's no talk about threat. Rather than seeing a threat, how do we bridge the gap? The gap that we can build a better country, a better world for everybody. And that's what we should look at. Thank you.
Thank you. We will.
I have a question. Question is, what can we do to include Japan in the discussion rather than and China in the discussion rather than taking it as a threat?
Include credibility.
Okay, so we will finish with that.
Thank you for your question. Well, I think if we look at the data, China has been increasingly actively included. For instance, if you look at the peacekeeping operation, China is a leading financial contributor and troop contributor. There is a China Peace and Development Fund with the United Nations. So I think even though there is kind of impression that China is increasingly isolated or excluded, I think if you look at the United Nations, China is already very much included. Even compared to sometimes European powers, I think. You can compare the contribution of China to PK operation to the contribution made by US, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, many other European countries, right? So that's why I think it is also important to look at the data. But thanks for your question.
Similar to Japan.
Yeah.
Final comment, 10 seconds on the how to change the discourse and so forth. I'm just going to give an anecdotal example that I think of. When I used to teach in the UK, we used to do an exercise and take a newspaper article from Japan in the late 80s, 90s, remove Japan, and then guess which article what it was about. And there is this famous book by Paul Kennedy, Rise and Fall of Great Powers, from the, I think, late 1980s, where he says literally, Japan will be the #1 in the future, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, 20 years later, the economy was slightly smaller even than it was at the time when the book was written and so forth. So slightly. So I think there is I'm thinking from this educational perspective, and I think these exercises are sometimes interesting to do with students too.
Thank you so much. And we will finish on a not a positive note, but it's John Mersheimer will have added this argument of threat perception to the tragedy of great power. But still hopes, diplomats are working, and we are in Geneva, the city of peace.
Yes.
We conclude with that. I thank you all for your participation here or online. Thank you so much for the panelists. It was a very, very instructive discussion. I was very pleased to start this conference series with you. And hopefully see you in a few months for another conference of the Webster Geneva Global Dialogue. Thank you so much to you.